Well, good afternoon, all, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Joel Curtin, and I'm the Advocacy Director at Partners in Health. And as we meet today, many of us, many countries are facing really concurrent global crises, and that's why we're here. Crises including soaring levels of poverty and hunger, and national economic and debt crises. And many countries in the global South were already in or near debt distress and debt crises before the COVID pandemic. And the economic impacts now are really far worse. So, while we're seeing rising food prices, exacerbating world hunger, we're seeing climate disasters increasing frequency and in ferocity. We're also facing the prospect of a looming debt crisis that threatens to pull, more and more vulnerable countries under. So, you know, for an organization like us, Partners in Health, the consequences of these crises, we see them quite literally embodied in sickness and illness. And the patients that Partners in Health serves around the world, are quite literally experiencing this on a daily basis, and experiencing unnecessary suffering and unnecessary death. And this is what our co-founder Paul Farmer called stupid deaths. So, if we think about any number of shocks to the global economy in this moment, from the war in Ukraine, the climate crisis, to geopolitical fragmentation, could really plunge developing countries into deeper distress. And that would have really profound consequences and repercussions for the United States, politically and economically. But things are not hopeless. There really is a tool that President Biden can use, even in a divided Congress, that would help stabilize the global economy, support developing countries' economies, whilst also protecting US export jobs all at the same time. And all this can be done at no cost to US taxpayers. And this tool is known as special drawing rights, or SDRs, and that's why we're here today to talk about. So with us here today to talk about what SDRs are, why we need a new issuance of SDRs, and why Congress support is so needed, we have with us today Dr. Mark Weisbrot, an economist, co-founder and co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. We have Kathy Feingold, director of the International Department of the AFL-CIO. We have Dr. Pauline Muchina, a theologian, scholar, and activist with the Advocacy Network for Africa and the American Friends Service Committee. We have Patricia Miranda, advocacy coordinator of LatinDad, which is the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice. So each presenter will share brief opening remarks, and then at 3 p.m. we'll open up for a Q&A. Of course, we understand if you need to leave at 3 p.m. And you can drop off, of course. The opening remarks from the speakers will be recorded, but the Q&A discussion will not be recorded. So before we start, I just wanted to say a quick thanks to Representative Chuy Garcia and to Senator Elizabeth Warren, with whom this event was coordinated. And also just a special thanks to our co-sponsors, including Action Corps, Advocacy Network for Africa, American Friends Service Committee, Center for Economic and Policy Research, Demand Progress Education Fund, Friends of the Earth US, Madre, National Advocacy Center of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, Partners in Health, Public Citizen, and Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. And with that, Dr. Weisbrot, the floor is yours. I believe you're still on mute. Yeah.
Thanks, Joel, and thanks to everyone for coming. And I think Isaac's going to put up the PowerPoint for me. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. That's, I think, not quite visible yet, is it?
Nope. No, it should be the moment here.
Okay. So I'm going to give a quick overview, and of course, There will be question and answer, and you can contact me as well if you have further questions. Go ahead. Next. So first, to just define what special drawing rights are. They're an international reserve asset. They're created by the IMF and distributed to member countries, and member countries can exchange them for hard currency within the IMF, and they can use them to pay for these essential imports like food and medicine. And I'll get to this again, but it's very important to understand that they add to the foreign reserve. So this asset is so creditworthy. It's like a U.S. Treasury bond. So if you have more international reserve assets, which all countries need, you can avoid, it can help you avoid capital flight, balance of payments crises, debt crises, budget crisis, and everything else. So that's why it has such a powerful impact. And the IMF can issue SDRs to member countries at any time. But the U.S. government can block almost any decision of the IMF, and so it's never been done without U.S. government support. Next. So in 2021, this was the largest, and this was big. To quote our President Biden, it was a big blank deal, he said, about something else. And I think it really was. This was, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of SDRs went to the developing countries, and the total issuance was 650 billion, but the rich countries can't use them. Theirs, and China can't either, by the way. The 209 billion that goes to developing countries is not including China. China has 3 trillion in reserves, so they don't use them. But anyway, the Congress played a huge role here. They twice passed a bill for the U.S. government to approve 2.8 trillion, which of course the IMF would have done, $2.8 trillion worth of special drawing rights, and that was passed twice by the House, and that's what got the Treasury to agree to it in 21. Next. So yeah, this is more help. This is how big it is. It's more aid than all the aid that goes from high-income countries to developing countries in an entire year. And the biggest thing about it is there's no conditions attached to it and no debt, and that's really big because so many countries have big debt crises now. Next slide. So, and it saves lives throughout the world. If you use the research that's available for the relation between recessions and mortality, you can see that hundreds of thousands of lives at least were almost certainly saved by this issuance, and the stability that it helped provide for the world economy. And here you can see the World Food Program has said we face an unprecedented global food crisis still in 2023, estimated 345 million people, one step away from starvation. And I always emphasize, because I think it's so important, most people don't know, that children are the hardest hit, because even from a famine or extreme hunger, because they will die from diseases that they ordinarily wouldn't die from, even if they have enough calories to survive. Next slide. So why are there so many risks ahead? Well, the growth of the global economy is very slow. You can see 2023, projected 2024, 3%. That's very, very low. You can say that, well, first of all, when the 2021 was approved in August, those SDRs, the economy was growing at 6%, twice as fast. And then, of course, the big spike in the pandemic and a war. And so, we needed them very badly. And that's a good lesson to learn. This is kind of an insurance policy. And especially IMF for the next 5 years is projecting the weakest economic growth in 50 years. And that's why the managing director has been emphasizing, just latest piece in Foreign Affairs, the serious need for low-income countries for international reserves as part of a global safety net. And she also made a big point out of the climate disasters, war, pandemic, and other unpredictable negative economic shocks that are a result of the economic and political fragmentation that's increasing in the world economy as we speak. Next slide. So the U.S. would really be hurt, and was hurt, by the last global downturn. That's what people don't see it as easily, but it's really, we lost, for example, in 2020, about 2 million export-related jobs from the rest of the world, shrinking demand for our exports. Okay, and here's the Department of Commerce estimate. The next slide. That's just for 2020, and you can see that was 1.8 million. But if you go a little further, we estimated 2.2 million for a few months more, with including a few months more. So this is really a big loss of jobs, and most of them come back, but not all, and they don't come back immediately if the economy is really bad. So that's why this is so directly important to the United States, because, as Joel mentioned, it's one of the few things that can be done with a divided Congress, because the executive can decide at the IMF to support the 650 billion again, and it happens. Next. So, conclusion. In a weak global economy, the SDRs can save some of the millions of jobs that we can lose as a result of shrinking global demand. And of course, this happens because it helps stabilize the global economy. And remember that the SDRs that are not spent are still extremely important because of the role they play, the stabilizing role, by being added to a country's reserves. Next. Yeah, and the role of Congress was really, that's the most important thing for you all, I think, is the role of Congress was decisive, and we know that from all the information we have in bringing about the issuance of hundreds of billions worth of SDRs to developing countries. And one last thing I will add is that no one has put forth, and there are people who oppose this, but no one has put forth an economic argument against the SDRs that economists would take seriously. And if you think you see one, please send it to me. There's my contact info, email, and cell phone. And I would like to see it. Even better if you could arrange a panel discussion with anyone who wants to put forward that argument and has some knowledge. And lastly, can I show the last slide with the current supporters of the SDR issuance, representing tens of millions of Americans? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that very helpful overview. I'll now turn it over to Kathy.
Great, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Feingold. I'm the International Director at the AFL-CIO, but I also wear another hat. I am the Deputy President of the International Trade Union Confederation. So I get to represent two of the organizations that are strongly supporting this SDR campaign. The ITUC represents over 200 million workers, and SDRs are a workers' issue. It has been from the beginning. I'm grateful for so many people here and for many of you in Congress who have supported this issue. We know working people have been disproportionately affected by the shocks of the war, the pandemic, and climate change. And we know that the inadequate response to the cost of living crisis, COVID-19, and the long delays in addressing the climate change we're all feeling have really led to greater inequality between and within countries, leaving millions of working people and their families behind. We actually saw during the pandemic that over 55% of working people don't have a single social protection. So this kind of investment, and Mark really laid it out, can be critical to addressing the needs of working people and their children and preventing people from falling into poverty. Unless we change the current economic model and multilateral system to ensure that they deliver for working people, we're going to continue to see a lot more crisis. So that's why the AFL-CIO and the global labor movement is working with this fantastic coalition. And we have been calling for a comprehensive reconstruction by the international financial institutions with policies that promote strong unions, collective bargaining, quality jobs that will contribute to a more healthy, caring, and sustainable global economy. The allocation of FDRs following the initial shock, as we just saw from the presentation, was a really important step forward in this direction, as it provided much needed liquidity, maximized other social benefits, again, those investments in social protections, building out a floor under working people, and it freed up resources for crisis response in developing countries. This spur of new development and growth within the global economy really laid a groundwork for a more just and equitable future. So we need your help to continue that momentum, continue to build this moving forward. It also helped to reduce the stress put on international supply chains during the time of the acute crisis, underscoring the global nature of the economy. Because the economic crisis crippling developing countries ultimately impacts all of us. We just saw that in the presentation. Here in the United States, workers have felt all of this in the price of basic goods at the grocery store, in the demand for US exports. A progressive global recovery is necessary, not only to relieve the burden of debt and for my siblings who are living in countries around the world who could benefit from SDRs, but also for workers here. Our struggles are inherently connected. As we face multiple global crises that threaten the livelihoods and aspirations of working families, debt relief has to be a critical part of the enabling environment for jobs and recovery. So I really hope that all of you will join in supporting our effort for a new allocation of SDRs, which will further demonstrate that transformative measures are needed to avoid future shocks related to climate, health, digitalization, among other challenges. This call for the new issuance of SDRs has been widely endorsed by the American labor movement, you just saw, by our affiliates, including the United Steelworkers, the Communication Workers of America, Unite Here. The AFL-CIO is proud to stand with you, as is the International Trade Union Confederation. We hope you'll all stand with us. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kathy, for those remarks. Pauline.
Good afternoon. Kathy, I love the phrase that you are routing for your siblings across the world, because I come from a faith community and we believe that everyone is a child of God, created in the image of God, and therefore we are siblings around the world. So thank you so much for reminding me that important phrase. I want to talk today about the impact of COVID in the African countries and the remedies that we've had. We know that by the time COVID hit African countries, it was already a challenging context where we were having underdevelopment, health challenges, hunger, droughts, and many other things that affected our continent, especially because of also the impact of climate change. By the time COVID hit, it was like a shock to already a very shaken continent. But, we waited to see what was going to happen. And thankfully, not so many people died, but the impact of the economic downturn of COVID was worse than the pandemic itself in the continent. People lost jobs, people got even more hungrier, countries became incapable of even doing the few things that they were having to cushion their citizens. The pandemic devastated, for example, the tourist industry in Kenya. It devastated the health system in South Africa. It did a mess on every African country that I can think of. And therefore, by August 2021, when the IMF issued special drawing rights, it was a lifeline for all of us in the African continents, but also other low and middle income countries. The African governments use the money to bolster their reserves. At least 40% of the SDRs were used to bolster reserves in the African continent. Others used to boost their health system. Others used for vaccines, like Senegal used it for vaccines. And many others, used it to make sure that they were still viable to lend money, to borrow money, or even to get grants to support their people. So from a faith perspective, we saved millions of lives, and that was a moral issue. The release of SDRs was not just a fiscal responsibility, but it was also a moral responsibility. And that's why we are coming again here to say that it is another moral responsibility for another issuance of SDRs. SDR allocations have already saved lives. So there is no reason why they shouldn't continue saving lives. And you can ask why again. And then as a person of faith, I would say, to whom much is needed, much is required. And that is in Luke chapter 28, chapter 12, verse 48. And I just want to let you know that a lot of people of faith are routing for another issuance of SDRs because they can see the impact that the previous one had. And there is no reason why the United States can't do it. Because as I said, much is given, to whom much is given, much is required. But really, the US is not even being required to use its own resources or the taxes of the people in United States. It is being asked to say yes, just the word yes. And the word yes from the United States government will transform millions of lives. That's why today I am appealing to you on behalf of the faith community for the US Congress to see this as a moral issue and to act, to ask the US government to say yes again to another issuance of special drawing rights. And it is not only going to benefit Africans, it will also benefit the United States in two ways. As it was mentioned earlier, the economy, the businesses of the United States lost businesses with countries around the world. When special drawing rights were done, then that changed it. And then also the relationship between African countries and United States become better if the US says yes again at IMF. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pauline, for that plea, and thank you for centering an SDR issuance as a moral issue. That's such an important point that you made, and thank you for doing so. Lastly, I'd like to pass to Patricia.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, I want to start by saying that all Latin American countries are classified as middle-income countries, even Haiti. So based on this criterion, after the pandemic started, basically no response policies were available for our countries. After that, the special drawing rights issuance was the only global policy that helped our countries to face the crisis. Though the pandemic is somehow over, despite 3 countries of Latin America were in the top of the list of deaths at that moment, we have still gaps in terms of health. But besides this, we have overall economic, social, and climate vulnerabilities that are higher. For instance, more than 80% of countries have less capacity to respond to climate crisis if we compare this with OECD countries. Food security rose from 26 to almost 40% in 5 years in Latin America. And you know that Latin America is one of the most unequal regions in the world. And these inequalities are carried basically by women. 40% of women are indebted with a loan in our region, which increased in 2021 for loans that women took to pay healthcare services. In terms of education, before the pandemic, 50% of children couldn't read a basic text. Projections due to the long closure of schools during the pandemic, projections calculate that this will reach to 80% of children that cannot read a simple or basic text. Just to name a few vulnerabilities that have been exacerbated and are more evident in the current multiple crisis. Overall, we are in more than half of the period to achieve the SDGs, but Latin America has advanced only 25% of these goals. So when we get to 2030, many people in Latin America will be left behind. So one of the main needs from our region is the access to concessional financing. After Africa, America Latina, and Latin America and the Caribbean was the second region in using more SDRs. Whether distribution is regressive, the use in our countries has been progressive in terms of GDP and international reserves. Our countries have been very active using SDRs. 19 countries in the region used SDRs with a variety of uses. Some of them needed to have international reserves, so they preserved them. Others needed to repay their debt with the IMF, for instance, and most of them used it for fiscal purposes. I can mention one case. In the case of Paraguay, they use it for budget health and social protection. So in addition, special drawing rights contributed to reduce austerity measures because in the face that we didn't have any other concessional financing, our countries would have had to make more cuts in their budgets. It is proven that southern countries will be the most benefited from a new issuance and allocation of SDRs. The fact that the US decides to facilitate no debt creating financing in a context of multiple crises would be key for our region to address the challenges for a sustainable development, as special drawing rights are a powerful mechanism to access to the urgently concessional financing that we need. So our call from Latin America is more special drawing rights for our region. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And just a huge thanks to all of our speakers. Clearly we've heard quite a bit about the risks that are facing the global economy today, and risks that really could impact not just the developing world, but of course the US economy as well. And we've heard why SDRs are so uniquely positioned as a cost-free tool to address some of these problems. And I think perhaps most importantly, what was said is that the voice of Congress here is really important in this issue. So I just want to say a big thanks again to co-sponsors and hosts, and thank you to all of you who have joined today. In the interest of time, if folks need to jump off, of course we understand. But if you do have more time, we're planning to stay on for another 15 minutes or so, and we can answer your questions and have a bit of discussion at this point in time with the speakers. So if you do have questions for the speakers, please raise your hand, and we'll call on you. And to the